Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Mama Charitable Foundation Visiting Professor in Buddhist Studies event series for the year 2015 to 16. The theme of the lecture series this year is A Buddhist View of Mindfulness and Consciousness. Mama Charitable Foundation has made a generous donation to the Center of Buddhist Studies of Hong Kong U in 2012 to establish an endowment fund which enables us to invite different Buddhist scholars to visit Hong Kong U each year to share with us the knowledge in their specialized fields. This year, we are very honored to have invited Professor Alan Wallace, founder and president of the Santa Barbara Institute for Consciousness Studies in the U.S., to be our Mama Charitable Foundation visiting professor. Before the lecture begins, I'd like to invite Professor Ian Halliday, Vice President and Pro-Vice Chancellor in Teaching and Learning in Hong Kong U, who is also the Chairman of the Management Committee of the Center of Buddhist Studies, to give the welcome speech. Professor Halliday, please.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Leung Ka-chai, Venerable Hin Hong, colleagues, students, and friends of the university, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us this evening for the first in a series of events sponsored by the Mama Charitable Foundation and led for us by visiting Professor Alan Wallace. I'd like particularly to thank Mr. Leung Ka-chai, the founder and director of the Mama Charitable Foundation, for sponsoring the series of events this month, as well as many other events that have been organized by the Center of Buddhist Studies here at Hong Kong U. The Foundation's mission is to promote Buddhism, education, and to help people in need through adversity in life or through calamity triggered by natural disaster. One of the major projects is the visiting professorship at the Center of Buddhist Studies, currently occupied by Professor Wallace. As we just heard, this was established through a donation in 2012 of 10 million Hong Kong dollars, which established a permanent endowment to support the appointment of visiting scholars here at the center. The visiting professorship is designed to attract visiting scholars of top distinction and renown in Buddhist studies to spend a period of time with us at Hong Kong U. Through the scheme, the center aspires to provide opportunities for teachers and students to interact with world-class scholars, to promote Buddhist studies in Hong Kong U and also in the wider society, to enhance our leadership in the international academic community, and to provide a knowledge exchange platform for Hong Kong, mainland China, and the rest of Asia. The scheme not only fits ideally into the Foundation's mission, but also has a very sentimental meaning, I believe, for the family. Among 11 members of the Foundation, 9 are from the Leung family. And many years ago, a much-loved grandmother within the family was herself a committed Buddhist in the traditional Chinese way. In her 80 years of life, she was devoted and compassionate, and her children and grandchildren, through the Foundation, thank her very much and miss her very much. I'd of course like to thank Professor Wallace for joining us tonight as the Mama Charitable Foundation visiting professor, and also for leading a whole series of events which will be inaugurated with the lecture this evening. Professor Wallace has taught Buddhist meditation and philosophy worldwide since 1976. He holds an undergraduate degree in physics and the philosophy of science from Amherst College in Massachusetts, and a PhD in religious studies from Stanford University. He is the founder and president of the Santa Barbara Institute for Consciousness Studies. In the series, there will be 2 more lectures, one on January the 27th and one on January the 29th. There will also be a 5-day meditation retreat from January the 22nd to the 26th. All are focused on one core topic, a Buddhist view of mindfulness and consciousness. This evening's lecture opens the series by focusing on Buddhist and psychological views of mindfulness, looking at the differences between Buddhist and modern psychological definitions of mindfulness. It will also evaluate mindfulness meditation and examine that within the rich context of Buddhist theories and practice in which mindfulness is identified as a mental factor vital for all aspects of spiritual practice, including ethics, mental balance, and insight. So once again, my thanks to Mr. Leung and the Mama Charitable Foundation, to Professor Wallace for being here as visiting professor, and to all of you for joining us this evening. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Wallace to deliver his lecture on Buddhist and psychological views of mindfulness. Professor Wallace, please.
Before the lecture begins, as a token of gratitude, we have prepared a little souvenir for presentation. So would like to invite Professor Holliday to present the souvenir to Professor Wallace. And now I'd also like to invite two more guests to the stage to have the group photo together. Mr. Casey Leung, founder and director of the Mama Charitable Foundation, and Venerable Hin Hong, director of the Center of Buddhist Studies. Thank you very much for the support of Mama Charitable Foundation. And thank you, of course, to Professor Wallace for coming all the way to Hong Kong to give the series of lectures and events this time. Thank you very much. So I would like to invite Professor Wallace to start the lecture today. Thank you.
So, good evening, everyone. It's truly a pleasure and an honor to be here. I had a wonderful dinner, I must mention, with the Venerable Hin Hong, Venerable Dhammadippa, and other members of the faculty of the Center for Buddhist Studies here. And I just came away with a sense of euphoria, frankly, hearing about the various programs that are being run here, the ecumenical nature of it, drawing from multiple traditions of Buddhism, integrating these in very practical ways that can really help people in their daily lives, while at the same time maintaining the integrity, the authenticity of the Buddhist tradition that has flourished and enriched the lives of so many civilizations over the last 2,500 years. So I hope I can slip into that current in the same motivation, the same theme, the same ideals this evening for the lecture, in which I'll address a very practical issue, the issue of mindfulness, and then over the next couple of lectures, again, address practical issues, but also very deep issues, by very nature of the mind, of consciousness itself. But we'll start with mindfulness, and I see my clicker here. As I'm sure many of you know, mindfulness, the whole mindfulness movement has become quite a global phenomenon, appearing in mainstream media. Many scientists have taken an interest in this field of neuroscience, psychology, psychotherapy. And so it's, really hitting the mainstream at this point. And I think in many ways it's a wonderful thing. A lot of practical benefit. I know some of the prime movers in that movement, Jon Kabat-Zinn and others. I know some of the psychologists involved in applying mindfulness to treating depression and so forth. And overall, I think they're doing really wonderful work. So if I stop right there, that would be perhaps enough. Excellent work, but there is more to be said about it. And so I'd like to step back before launching right into the topic of mindfulness explicitly. Everybody needs to be mindful. Whether you're a cook, you have to be mindful. Don't burn your food. If you're a soldier, you need to be mindful as a soldier. If you're a doctor, if you're a mother raising children, and so on. If you're robbing a bank, whatever you're doing, we need to be present, we need to be attentive, we need to be mindful. But is that really what mindfulness is about? Is it simply that? Because mindfulness can be applied to very meaningful, constructive, and virtuous endeavors, certainly. It can be applied to very neutral things, like playing football. Nothing wrong with it, nothing really virtuous about it. But if you want to play football well, you have to be very mindful. And then, of course, there are activities. I gave the example of robbing a bank, probably not terribly relevant to the people here, but I think we'd all agree that's not a good thing to do. But if you're planning a bank heist, that'll take a lot of mindfulness. You don't want to get caught. You want to get the loot. And so, before launching into mindfulness, I think it's worthwhile to take a step back. to motivation. There's a term in English that is not very well known, but I found it very useful. Psychologists know it. It's called conation. Conation. It's a faculty of desire, intention. It has to do with our values, our goals and aspirations, our ideals. And so I'd like to start with this. Two quotes by people, one person I deeply respect and the other one I deeply revere. Einstein. I've taken a lot of interest in him. I've read his biographies and so forth. I've studied physics. And he was truly a great person as well as a brilliant physicist. A deep thinker, a philosophical thinker, a man of peace. He really promoted nonviolence. And so he addresses the issue that we already care about. I'd like to start there. Every person in this room, what do we already care about without any persuading, without knowing anything about Buddhism necessarily? And that is happiness. And so Albert Einstein made this statement. Well-being and happiness, he writes, never appeared to me as an absolute aim, and I'm even inclined to compare such moral aims to the ambitions of a pig. And that is, if you sense the meaning of your life, what your life is all about is simply to be happy, Einstein thought, well, that's not saying a lot. If you could have a conversation with a pig, the pig would say the same thing. They also want to be happy. Why shouldn't they want? They want good food, they want a nice place to sleep, they want to mate occasionally, they want to do what pigs make pigs happy. And so do we. But why should we think there's something noble about that? I'm not putting down pigs any more than I put down dogs or donkeys, but there's nothing very lofty, nothing very noble about simply wanting to be happy. And if that's the whole aim of your life, is simply to be happy, he's saying, well, no big deal, frankly. Right? And I think we see his point. On the other hand, we have this statement. I put these two together like thesis and antithesis. It looks like these two, Albert Einstein and the Dalai Lama, are making very opposite statements. So let's see what the Dalai Lama has to say in this regard. He says, I believe that the very purpose of our life is to seek happiness. Whether one believes in religion or not, whether one believes in this religion or that religion, we are all seeking something better in life. So it looks like these two are diametrically opposed. One is saying, there's nothing lofty about that. That's not the meaning of life. That's not the purpose of life. It's kind of trivial, frankly. We should be thinking loftier, nobler thoughts. And the Dalai Lama said, no, this is it. Bullseye. If you want to be happy, this is the very purpose of life. So is this the case? Are they simply disagreeing? Or may there be a way of understanding these two seemingly diametrically opposed statements to be compatible with each other? I just want to linger just for a moment before going to the next slide to this final statement. I think it's very important, actually. We are all seeking something better in life. I think to a very large extent that's true. And I don't know enough to say that this is unique to our human species, but I think it is a distinctive characteristic of many thoughtful human beings. Something better in life. But when we think of something better in life, what comes to mind? Better food, better lodging, more money, more prestige, more power. What's better? What's the criterion of better? Is it simply more of what we already value, what we already have? Or is better something more meaningful than that? So I present you first with what looks to be like two very different statements that would seem to be in opposition to each other. If one's right, the other one must be wrong. But I think not. These are both very deep thinkers, and I would suggest that Einstein and the Dalai Lama are addressing two different types of happiness. This distinction, I'm using the Greek term that is from the Greek hedonia to hedonic, we all know the term. And then the second one, authentic well-being, in Greek is eudaimonia. So the Greeks, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they're very familiar with these terms. They're very important in Greek philosophy. We find it in Buddhism. I won't give the whole bandwidth here, but we find it in Buddhism of terms of laukika sukha, mundane happiness, as opposed to sat sukha, sublime happiness, or samyak sukha, authentic well-being, authentic happiness. And we find this in multiple traditions. You find it in Christianity, and you find it in Hinduism. When speaking of Sat Chit Ananda is joy, bliss, happiness, but not what Einstein was rather denigrating. So you see here, these are bullet points. These are distinctions that I've drawn. I've not read this in any classic Buddhist text, but I would say this is completely consonant with or harmonious with the Buddha's own teachings and later teachings in the Theravada, the Mahayana traditions, of drawing a sharp and clear distinction between these two types of happiness, two types of sukha. So I'm going to use the term hedonic, could be mundane, but I'll stick with hedonic or simply hedonia, and I'm going to define it in the following way. We're all familiar with it, so I'm speaking about something you've already experienced, but I'm saying it's this bandwidth. The whole range of pleasure that's derived from or arises in response to pleasant stimuli. And it's the avoidance of unpleasant stimuli. So we all know what this is like. We have a very good meal. I just had a very tasty meal. I had very pleasant, interesting companions over dinner. We had good conversation. I enjoyed their company. That's hedonia. It's coming from outside. I could have had an awful meal with very aggressive, hostile companions at dinner. That would not have been pleasant. So it's not just, when I use the word hedonic, I'm not referring to hedonism. Hedonism is something quite base and crude and vulgar and which many people look down upon. Because the dinner I just had, I experienced a lot of hedonia in that. There's nothing vulgar about it at all. It was very interesting conversation, inspiring, tasty, healthy, vegetarian food. So there's no downside to it all, but it's hedonia. And why? Because it was pleasant stimuli coming in. Not just sensual, as in the taste and the fragrance and so forth of food, but also the conversation, the companionship, and so forth. But that too I'm calling hedonia, right? It's stimulus-driven. It's very simple. It's stimulus-driven. And so much of our lives in the pursuit of happiness is looking for friendly people to engage with, being in nice environments, having good food, nice dwelling, good clothing, and so forth. And so I would say within this bandwidth, or this spectrum of hedonia, there's a wide variety. Some types of hedonia are very virtuous. They are wholesome. They are positive. It's a wide range of that is stimulus-driven. When you see your children growing up healthy, you've been the best parent that you can be, and you see your children growing up healthy, they're wholesome, they're happy, they're loving, and you see how your children are flourishing. It gives you some happiness, right? That's good happiness. That's very virtuous happiness, taking delight in the health, happiness, and so forth of your children. There's nothing unwholesome about that, right? And so it can be virtue. It can be neutral, simply enjoying a tasty beverage or a nice vegetarian meal, the one we just had. It's not virtuous, it's not non-virtuous, it's neutral. Ethically speaking, it's neutral. But then there's also hedonia, a bandwidth of hedonia, which is by nature quite negative, destructive, harmful. And the Germans have a term for this. I mean, one type of that is called Schadenfreude. Schadenfreude, taking delight in someone else's misery, their failure, their disgrace, and so forth, because you don't like them. You say, they got what's coming to them. Good. That made my day. That person was disgraced. That person was, met with failure. Well, that's rejoicing. It feels really good. There's nothing wholesome about that at all. And so there's a wide range of sukha, of hedonia, that is really quite harmful. I would say just very briefly as an analogy, the pursuit of happiness, I would say exactly what Albert Einstein was referring to. The type of pleasure that a pig looks for. A type of pleasure that we look for. We enjoy good food and pleasant environment and so forth and so on. And it's not only sensory, but also when I travel a lot and I see people in airplanes playing solitaire or watching movies and so forth, but sometimes just doing intellectual things like, a video game or whatever, not so intellectual. But we can have intellectual stimulation, aesthetic stimulation. And when that stimulation is pleasant, our response is pleasure, and that's hedonia. And so hedonia is something that we get from the world. I like to boil this down sometimes. Hedonia is something we get from the world. And so we hunt for it, we look for it, and we gather it. Hunter-gatherer approach. A very long phase of human history, human species. Go out into the world. You don't have happiness at home. You don't have what you want. You're not satisfied to stay at home. You go out into the world to look for something you don't have, to find some happiness out there. It could be acquiring some acquisition. Maybe it's acquiring a mate. Maybe it's acquiring territory. Maybe more intangible things like power or prestige. You go out for it, you look for it, if you get it, you gather it and bring it home. Hunter-gatherer approach. There's a problem built into that. An enormous problem, actually. It gives rise to all types of conflict. And that is, generally speaking, not uniformly, not universally, but generally speaking, the pursuit of hedonia, of hedonic pleasure, is by nature competitive. If one person has more, somebody else has less. If one country has more, some other country has less. And the people who got less generally don't like that. They wanted more. And so jealousy arises, competition arises, conflict arises, wars happen. I don't think there's ever been a war in the human history that was fought over genuine well-being. Don't think it ever happened. But war over resources, power, and so forth, all of them. So I think that's what Einstein was referring to. He said, if that's all you have in mind in your pursuit of pleasure, of happiness, well, nothing very noble about that, right? Now, when the Dalai Lama says, on the contrary, and he and so many others, you find the Hindu tradition, the Greek tradition, the Hindu tradition, the Taoist tradition, basically wisdom traditions throughout history, East and West, ancient and modern, the distinction is drawn, including in philosophy, and including now over the last 15 years or so, in psychology. The distinction is made now between eudaimonia, many psychologists know the term, and they know it's something different than simply sensory-based or stimulation-driven pleasure. So happily, this is a unifying concept or a unifying distinction, because multiple religions highlight this in various ways with nuances. It comes up in philosophy, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and right through to the present day, but it's also found in science, in psychology. So it's unifying. Right? So now, the Dalai Lama has been my teacher since 1971, so I think I have some insight when he teaches. I think I have some idea often what he's referring to. So when he says this is the very purpose of life, the very meaning of life, as we seek something better, well, it's very clear to me he's a Buddhist monk. He's not referring to hedonia, hedonic pleasure. No way, that's not possible. So he's referring to something deeper. And so Sat Sukha, Samyak Sukha, sublime well-being or authentic well-being, and I'm defining it in the following way. It's a sense of flourishing, a sense of well-being. It's a very nice term in English, derived not from what we get from the world. So here's again a bullet point. Hedonia is what we get from the world. It's pleasure, satisfaction, joy, and so forth that we get from the world. I had a great day, something very nice happened to me, and I feel very good, you know? Whereas in contrast to that, this genuine or authentic well-being is something we bring to the world. Hedonia we get from the world. It's being fortunate. It's having good karma ripening. It's being lucky. It's being fortunate, right? Whereas while we pursue hedonia, we cultivate eudaimonia. We cultivate it. It comes from within. It comes from what we bring to the world rather than what we get from it. And therefore, the cultivation of eudaimonia is not, and I don't think it ever is, competitive. If I have more, nobody else has less. If one country has more, no other country has any less. So that's a great strength here. And as we look at this issue in the year 2016, where we have 7 billion people on the planet, all of them are looking for something better, and frankly, all of us to varying extents are looking for greater hedonia. With diminishing resources, growing population, how's that going to turn out? If the human population, all 7 billion of us, are thinking, as we look for something better in life, that's more of the same. I want to acquire more, I want to consume more, I want to have more power, more prestige. How's that going to work out if 7 billion people all want the same thing? We all want to consume more. How is it going to turn out? Do we really expect all the nations of the world to have ever-increasing gross domestic product, and that's going to turn out well over the long term? So I think in raising this simple issue, the distinction between hedonia and eudaimonia, I think we're addressing issues here that are of enormous import to modern civilization. If 7 billion people single-pointedly pursue greater acquisition, more consumption, more hedonia, there isn't enough. That's it. Our planet has finite resources. And that's just going to lead to tragedy. This is like a Greek tragedy. You know how it ends. Now. So my feeling is that children all over the world should be introduced to the distinction between the two. One you have, when all is said and done, you have very little control over. Who can control even our own health? Could Steve Jobs control his own health? All the money one he'd possibly want. But it couldn't save his life. And that's true for all of us, rich or poor. There are many factors we simply cannot control. In terms of hedonia, it's good luck. In terms of eudaimonia, genuine or authentic well-being, that has nothing to do with luck. That's an investment, not a gamble. And so speaking very much now from the Buddhist context, where does this authentic well-being come from? Well, we can start with an ethical way of life, shila in Sanskrit, an ethical way of life, and it's very simple. For all the complexities of ethics in Buddhism, discussions of karma and the vinaya and so forth, it actually boils down to something very simple. Leading an ethical way of life, bottom line, is abiding by the principle of nonviolence. Nonviolence with the body, the speech, and the mind. Don't do any harm. And you'll be happier. You'll be happier. If your interactions with the environment, with other human beings, other species, if you're generally speaking, your North Star by which you navigate your life is one of, well, at least I don't want to do any harm, you'll be happier. And it's not hedonia. It's something you're bringing to the world. But that's only half the equation for ethics in the Buddhist understanding. It's more than simply being nonviolent or not harm. It's benevolence. The other side of the equation is benevolence. As we say, try not to harm when you have the opportunity. Do some good. Try to be of service. Alleviate the suffering of others. Bring others happiness. When the opportunity is there, go for it. That's the meaning of life. Right? And there's satisfaction there. You all know it. You know the satisfaction of taking care of your children, your spouses, your family, your community. We all do it. I think all of us here do this in various ways. And we know when we've done something good, we've made some contribution that was meaningful and helpful. You didn't get it from the world. It's something you brought to the world. And there's a kind of satisfaction in that, a contentment, a sense of meaning, that today I did something good, therefore today my life was meaningful. And no one can take that away. You didn't get it from the world, so who can possibly take that away from you? I think 5-year-olds can understand this. This is not complex. This is not esoteric. There's a joy of receiving a gift. Every 5-year-old knows this. Or can be introduced to it very simply. There's a joy of receiving a gift. Oh, just what I wanted. I'm so happy. I'm going to enjoy this a lot. Okay? 5-year-old, 80-year-olds, we all know it's nice to get a gift. Right? That's hedonia. And then when you give a lot of thought, you'd really like to do something kind for another person, whether it's a stranger, a colleague, family member, give it a lot of thought and say, I think this person would really enjoy this. And you find a gift. And then with no strings attached. Sometimes we do strings attached, but leave that aside. No, I just like to do something that will make this person happy. And you give it some thought and you purchase it and then you give it. And you see their face light up. And you say they really enjoyed it. You hit the target. You got something they really did enjoy. You gave it enough thought, and you see them light up. They say, oh, they're very... Then what do you do when you see somebody smiling like that? What do? You can't help it. You start smiling. Your mirror neurons, they say, start firing away, if you want to look at this neurophysiologically. There's satisfaction, there's joy in that, of seeing that this person really enjoys. And it's not their gratitude or what you'll get back. It's seeing that, oh, this made this person very happy. I'm very glad. That's eudaimonia. The joy you get from what you brought to the world without anticipation, what do I get back? No? That's ethics. And that's where it starts. In the Buddhist worldview, if you lack the foundation of ethics, you have no foundation for anything else. You can meditate, you can study, be a scholar, a yogi, but if you lack the foundation of ethics, you've got nothing. It's like building a house with no foundation, nothing. And so there's the foundation, but on the basis of that, then the teachings of the Buddha move forward. Shila Samadhi, Samadhi. I think we all know the term. It's now in the Oxford English Dictionary. Samadhi means very focused attention in its narrow term. But when we speak of this Shila Samadhi, and then we'll have Prajna, wisdom, the basic structure of the Buddhist path to a liberation, in the broader context as a training, not simply a technique or a skill of being very focused, concentration and so forth, Samadhi means more than simply focused attention. I would say, it's my interpretation, that this broad bandwidth of practices, including the cultivation of loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity, and so forth, these all fit within the context of Samadhi. And so I would say Samadhi really is about mental balance, developing an exceptionally healthy, balanced, wholesome mind. This is brought about by cultivating the mind. The Sanskrit term bhavana, which we commonly translate as meditation, in the Sanskrit it means cultivation. Bhavana literally means cultivating. And so once we're back again, not to pursuing happiness, like it's out there and I need to run and find it, but right there in your mind, cultivate your mind. That's your field. So we have the hunter-gatherer approach for hedonia, and we have the cultivator approach for eudaimonia. Stay home, cultivate your own field, and your field is your mind. There's a lot of satisfaction in that. Cultivate your mind through meditation and other methods. Cultivate your mind, refine your mind, develop your mind, balance your mind in a multitude of ways. And then you'll see, even when you're sitting in solitude, and you have no stimulation coming at all, you're just sitting quietly in a room, as I just was for the last half hour. There was nothing happening. It was an empty room, except for me. I didn't even drink the water. Right? And so can you be content? Can you experience a sense of well-being, of serenity, of calm, of peace, of satisfaction, with no stimulation at all? The answer is yeah, it's possible. Cultivate your mind. And you can be very content, you can be happy in solitude with no stimulation coming in. But also if you have a balanced mind, you can go out and meet with many people, you can be in a social gathering, you can be at work. And it's what you bring to the workplace, what you bring to society. A very healthy, balanced, wholesome mind. And that is eudaimonia. It gives rise to eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is a symptom of a healthy mind. Dukkha is a symptom, dukkha as in suffering, dissatisfaction, and so on, is a symptom of a mind that's in a state of imbalance. And so we have Shila, Samadhi. Samadhi brings it to another level through the cultivation of the mind, a sense of well-being that really comes right from the very nature of your mind, as a symptom of a very balanced, healthy, well-cultivated mind. And then we finally have the culmination, prajna, wisdom, a sense of well-being, of joy, of satisfaction, of contentment and fulfillment through having increasing understanding, insight. What's going on? What's the nature of the world we're living in? What's the nature of our bodies, our minds? What's the nature of our identity? There's a joy from knowing reality as it is. And it's the deepest type of joy, the most liberating kind of joy. And that was just the framework of the whole Buddhist path to enlightenment. So I've lingered a lot on the slide. I can't linger on all the rest of the slides to such an extent. But I think the distinction is enormously important. We're going to get back to mindfulness very quickly. But if you want to cultivate mindfulness, why? Conative, what's your desire? What's your intention? What's your aspiration? What's it all for? And mindfulness is being taught for all kinds of things. Reduce stress, that's nice. It's ethically neutral. Like taking, sitting in a jacuzzi, having a massage, or taking Valium, jogging, listening to music. All kinds of things can reduce stress. And none of those were bad. And practicing meditation to reduce stress is not bad. It's not dharma. It's not virtue. It's not bad. Right? So mindfulness, yeah, but why? Is it really, when all is said and done, for the health benefits, greater productivity in the workplace, more money, better human relationships, better dating life, What's the motivation? I think everything hinges on motivation here. So there it is, 3 dimensions of well-being. I can now really move faster. I have to. Time is running out. But ethics, leading an ethical way of life, gives rise to social and environmental flourishing or authentic well-being. Social as with our fellow human beings, environmental with all of the other sentient beings on the planet, and the ecosphere itself. If we don't live in harmony with our ecosphere, we are doomed. And so there's one level, there's the foundational level. On the basis of that, cultivating the mind, cultivating mental balance, gives rise to psychological, authentic well-being or flourishing. And then finally, wisdom, a deeper kind of flourishing, a type of flourishing, a type of authentic well-being that when cultivated deeply, carries us through. It's really our internal refuge. It's a taking of refuge. And it takes us through the vicissitudes of life. The adversities and the felicities, through good health and bad health, through living and dying. And it is possible to die well. It is possible while dying to be flourishing. That's a fact. I know many people who have died in that way, and I know others who have not. Dying can be miserable, filled with anxiety, fear, dread, anger, sadness, pain. And there are others for whom the dying process is the culmination of an already immensely meaningful life. And the dying process is the culmination, the celebration of an already meaningful life. Whether we die or not is not a matter of choice. How we die is. And so, wisdom. So now we come to mindfulness, and I'm going to start with mindfulness within the Buddhist context. And mindfulness is not a type of meditation in Buddhism. I've never heard of mindfulness meditation in any classic Buddhist text. Zen, Theravada, Indian, Tibetan, I've never heard it. Mindfulness meditation, that doesn't exist. Mindfulness is a mental factor, one of 51, 52 mental factors, depending on the system you're working with. And the definition given here by one of the great Indian Mahayana Buddhist pundits, contemplatives, Asanga, in his Abhidhamma Sammuccaya, he defines it very crisply and I think in a very non-controversial way. Although the Theravada tradition doesn't define it in exactly the way, it's really the same family. So this is very representative, I think, for all of Buddhism. So mindfulness as a mental factor, what is it? It is a non-forgetfulness of the mind. Bear in mind the Sanskrit, the Pali, Sanskrit, Tibetan, and so forth, the terms that we translate as mindfulness, it has a primary connotation of recollection, remembering. That's a primary connotation. And so the opposite of remembering is forgetting, right? And so this is a non-forgetfulness of the mind with respect to some familiar object, one you've encountered, and having the function of non-distraction. It's a bit technical, but it's not difficult. And so when mindfulness arises, let's say mindfulness of your breath. You're practicing mindfulness of breathing, anapanasati. So practicing mindfulness of breathing, what are you not forgetting? The in and out flow of the breath. And you're familiar with it already. And then as you're attending to the in-breath, the out-breath, the in-breath and out-breath, you're doing so with a continuity such that you're not becoming distracted. So we attend to something familiar, we do so without forgetting it, and as we maintain that flow of our awareness, our attention, we do so without distraction. The mental faculty that enables us to attend to any given topic, theme, object, person, situation, that enables us to attend voluntarily without forgetfulness, without distraction, that's mindfulness. So no child or no adolescent or adult can possibly get an education without mindfulness. So very useful definition. There's nothing particularly religious about it. No belief system built into that. There it is. There's mindfulness. And then we have a term that in the Buddha's own teachings and the commentary literature for centuries and centuries after him, the mindfulness, sati, or in Sanskrit smriti, is often coupled with another term, translated variously, and I'm going to translate it as introspection. It's sampajanya, or Sanskrit samprajanya. Translated different, I won't give a whole scholarly discourse on different translations, but something characteristic of this sampajanya is it's reflexive. I can be mindful of your presence here, but I cannot practice introspection of your presence here. Introspection is always reflexive. So I'm aware of my hands moving right now. My hands tend to move a lot when I talk. Nothing unwholesome there, so I've not tried to bind them. And so, but if I'm aware of the movements of my hands as I speak, That's reflexive. That's samprajanya. Am I aware of my posture, aware of hand movements? Am I aware of my speech? Am I speaking too quickly? Am I saying something meaningful? Is it wholesome? Is it too loud, too fast, too slow, too so? Am I aware of my speech in a discerning fashion? And then, of course, my thoughts, my motivations, the state of my mind. We can be reflexively aware of our own thoughts, our emotions, desires, and so forth. That too, that ability, that faculty to reflexively turn the awareness inward upon our own physical presence and behavior, when walking, standing, and so forth, our speaking, our thoughts, and so forth, all that samprajanya. And Shantideva, the great 8th century Bodhisattva, great scholar, great contemplative, he defines introspection, or samprajanya. Very concisely, he says, at the end of a chapter with this title, Introspection, in brief, this alone is the definition of introspection, the repeated examination of the state of one's body and mind. All right? So these two together, when you're practicing mindfulness of breathing, which in this retreat will start, I think, tomorrow evening, I'm going to be teaching that, among other methods, for training the attention in mindfulness. And so you direct your attention to the sensations of the breath, and you sustain your awareness with mindfulness, right? But then introspection is kind of quality control. That introspection monitors the flow of mindfulness. The mindfulness which is directed to the in and out breath. But as you're attending, are you becoming forgetful? Are you slipped into mind wandering? Are you falling asleep? Are you spacing out? And so it's introspection that enables us to know what's the quality of mindfulness. Is it clear? Is it stable? Or is it distracted or dull? That goes for our desires. When desires arise, are we aware of the desires that arise and not simply aware of what we desire? When we experience emotions coming and going, are we aware of not only what we are emoting about, other people, situations, are we aware of our emotions as they're arising from moment to moment? That ability, that reflexive ability is called introspection. These are from two classic sources, and this is very, frankly, it's very representative, I think, of all of Inter-Tibetan Buddhism. And then we draw from a more contemporary scholar, one of the pioneers of Western scholarship of Buddhism. And so Carolyn Rice Davids writes here, and this is way before this whole modern mindfulness movement that started, let's say, in the 70s or so. So she's writing before that. And she said, the Theravada view of mindfulness has, quote, much in common with a Western modern theory of conscience, or moral sense, as an inward mentor, discriminating between good and bad and prompting choice. I think she nailed it. Very good scholarship, right? So those pioneers, they weren't stupid. They did some really groundbreaking work, laid the foundations for later generations. So we can see these are all very consonant with each other. Nothing anomalous about this, actually very representative. We have sati in Pali, sati, mindfulness. But within the Eightfold Noble Path, we also then have this samma. For each of them, samma, which is often translated as right, as in right mindfulness. It's not bad. It's not wrong. But I think authentic is a bit closer. Authentic mindfulness, authentic livelihood, authentic speech, authentic physical behavior, and so forth. And so when we speak of mindfulness within the context of a path to liberation, within the context of path of spiritual practice, now it's more than simply not forgetting or not being distracted. After all, a sniper or a bank robber could be cultivating mindfulness as a Sangha defined it, and be very mindfully, very focused, without forgetting, without being distracted, plan your heist and then rob a bank, right? So there's nothing ethical, nothing spiritual or virtuous built into a Sangha's definition. It can be unwholesome, ethically neutral, or positive. But when we go to samma sati, authentic mindfulness, then we have to add a bit more. And Nagasena, the great Indian Buddhist arhat, in his conversation with King Milinda, or in Greek Menander, in the Milinda Panya, he was asked by the king, what's mindfulness? Here's Nagasena's quite definitive and authoritative response. But we know by context he's referring not just to the mental factor, but to samma, this authentic mindfulness that really can transform the mind, transform one's life, and lead one on the path to liberation. So, to read it quite right through here, mindfulness, when it arises, calls to mind, or is distinctly aware of, wholesome and unwholesome, kusala and akusala, tendencies with faults and faultless, inferior and refined, dark and pure, together with their counterparts. These refers to the concomitant mental factors. So mindfulness arises, but together with other mental factors. And they go in a cluster. So they have these qualities in common. Mindfulness, when it arises, follows the courses of beneficial and unbeneficial tendencies. So it's very discerning. It's observing not only the mental events coming up, but also what are their consequences. If I think in such a way, desire in such a way, act in such a way, what are the consequences? When we see what's the impact on the people around us, upon myself, the environment, beneficial or non-beneficial. So it's very discerning. It's intelligent, it's ethical, and it recognizes these tendencies are beneficial, these unbeneficial, these tendencies are helpful, these unhelpful. Thus, one who practices yoga or engages in spiritual practice rejects unbeneficial tendencies and cultivates beneficial tendencies. That's core Buddhism. But frankly, it's just core truth. Nothing uniquely Buddhist about this. If you want to be happy, cultivate beneficial tendencies and attenuate unbeneficial ones. That's just almost common sense. It's very wise, but it just makes sense. And he's just defined authentic mindfulness. As opposed to the more mental factor, this is authentic. This is by nature virtuous, meaningful, leads you to the path of liberation. But now always within the Buddhist context, when we speak of especially authentic mindfulness, any element of the path, it's within context. No method, no mental factor, no meditative practice stands alone in isolation, like getting an injection or like taking a pill. Take this pill, this will solve your problems. Buddhist meditative practice is Buddhist mental factors, elements of the authentic Eightfold Noble Path. They're always within context. And so authentic mindfulness must be conjoined with, informed by, authentic view. Eightfold Noble Path, one of the 8. And so here's the Buddha himself. What is authentic view? It's wonderful to have these succinct definitions, and there's no controversy, there's no debate about it. This is what he said. What is authentic view? And bear in mind, this is not just a belief, it's a way of actually viewing reality. How do you view reality in a way that is congruent with reality? So what is it? It is this knowledge of suffering. Knowledge of the origin of suffering, knowledge of the cessation of suffering, knowledge of the path leading to the cessation of suffering. This is called authentic view. It sounds very Buddhist, but it's also simply meaningful. Whether you're Buddhist, non-Buddhist, religious, non-religious, everybody wants to be free of suffering. And if you're going to go about that in an intelligent fashion, you better identify what's causing the suffering. It's like if you're ill, find out what makes you ill, right? It's sensible. And then, if you're ill, and you see what's causing you to be ill, then the next question, of course, is, can I get better? Can I be healed? Can the illness, the suffering I'm experiencing, come to an end? Third Noble Truth. And then if it's thumbs up on that one, then you would say, great, what do I need to do? What's the therapy? What do I need to do? Do I need to take medication, have surgery? What needs to be done? What's the path? And getting it right. I mean, isn't that important for everybody? Whether you're Buddhist, non-Buddhist? Isn't it true for all sentient beings? None of us want to suffer. We all want to be happy. If we don't want to suffer, we have to know what's making us suffer. We have to see whether it's possible to be free, and then do what needs to be done. There's another one here. Authentic intention is often called right thought. So I prefer authentic intention. It's a bit closer, I think. That's my interpretation. Maybe I'm wrong. But this is another, of course, of the Eightfold Noble Path. What is authentic intention? This has to do with conation, you remember? Desire, intention, aspiration, goals. What is authentic intention, which is so enormously important if you want to cultivate mindfulness in a meaningful fashion? It is the intention of renunciation. Renunciation doesn't just mean being an ascetic or being grumpy. It has to do with recognizing what truly makes you happy. What are the actual causes of suffering? And cultivate that which really brings about happiness. Right? That's renunciation. It's the intention of renunciation, the intention of goodwill or benevolence. It's the intention of not harming. We've just seen the essence of Buddhist ethics. This is called authentic intention. without an authentic intention, without authentic view, I think my own sense is, my interpretation is authentic mindfulness is not going to happen. It doesn't stand all by itself. Okay, that was a thumbnail sketch. We just did the Buddhist part. So it's quite clear, I think. I don't think I said anything really iconoclastic or pretty basic, quite universal, quite representative. It's Buddhism. It's a Buddhist view. Theravada Buddhism, Indian Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. You'll find nuances, differences here and there, but I think that was very representative of really all of Buddhism. And then we have this mindfulness movement, which is quite recent, let's say 40 years, 50 years. And so here's a definition. Of course, there are different definitions, but this is very representative of mindfulness in this so-called mindfulness movement, mindfulness meditation. This now become a global phenomenon, many scientific studies, taught in the marketplace and the business place, and so forth and so on. So this definition, very representative. So now hold in mind what the Buddhist definition was in that whole context, and here this is. Mindfulness in the modern context, is, backstep there, a kind of non-elaborative, which means it doesn't get caught up in a lot of cogitation, thinking, rumination, and so forth. It's simple, direct, right to the point, non-elaborative, non-judgmental. I have a lot more to say about that, but we know what it means. Generally speaking, being non-judgmental, there's no mystery to that. It's present-centered, that's very clear. Be here now, Ram Dass, 40, 50 years ago. It's a present-centered awareness in which each thought, feeling, or sensation that arises in the attentional field is acknowledged and accepted as it is. So that's part of the non-judgmental aspect. Whatever comes up in your mind, just generally speaking, whatever comes up, just be present with it. That's what's happening, accept it. That's what's happening. It's like the weather. You don't like cloudy weather, you don't like it drizzly, well, tough luck, that's what's happening. That's what's happening right now. Deal with it. So, but as with the weather, as with the environment, as so with your mind, whatever's coming up, maybe it's benevolence, it's calm, it's agitated, it's hateful, it's lustful, it's generous, compassionate, whatever's coming up, acknowledge it, be aware of it, and then accept it. That's the way things are. So, I would say, I know John Kabat-Zinn now for a long time, more than 20 years. Very representative of his, but not just one person. He's very, very prominent in the whole field of the mindfulness movement, mindfulness-based stress reduction. So this is not his definition. You can see the source. But this is very representative and very, very congruent with John's own views of mindfulness, which he teaches with enormous enthusiasm and effectiveness. There's a definition. You can see it has actually very little in common. I mean, there it was. I gave the Buddha, I give a Sangha, and so forth, and the Nagasena. And you can see this is very different. This is very different. So to say that this is the essence of Buddhism, you don't have a leg to stand on, let alone two. You're floating in sheer speculation. But now you can make that into a meditation. And that is just sitting, being very present. Maybe you're peripherally watching the breath a little bit, but you're attending to whatever comes up in the mind and so forth, and just being present with whatever comes up in a non-judgmental way. Well, now it has to be scores, if not hundreds, of scientific studies have been done of mindfulness. Its advocates, quite understandably, highlight, emphasize, celebrate the efficacy of mindfulness meditation as studied in a myriad of studies. It's run in hundreds by now, I'm sure, all over the world, Australia, South America, Europe, and so forth. But here is one meta-study done. Meta-study. And it's published in JAMA. I mean, there's no more prestigious journal than the Journal of the American Medical Association. And so they did a great big meta-study, a very large-scale study, very objective, rigorous, published in one of the two most prestigious journals for medicine, and this were the conclusions. Okay, so there's no evaluation from me. I'm just saying this is what they found. So they found mindfulness meditation programs had moderate evidence of improved anxiety, depression, and pain. Okay, so some benefit there. That's not insignificant at all. Less anxiety, less depression, less pain, moderate, nothing something exceptional, but good. Low evidence of improved stress, distress, and mental health related quality of life, so not much there. And then low evidence of no effect or insufficient evidence of any effect on positive mood, attention, substance use, eating habits, sleep, and weight. That's quite sobering, I think would come as a surprise. And I emphasize this was a very, very large study, quite definitive at its time. It's not to say it's the final study, but this is what they found. And then we found, and they say, and this is a direct quote, we found no evidence that meditation programs were better than any active treatment, such as drugs, exercise, and other behavioral therapies. Well, I found that one very troubling. Not that I don't like the results. I mean, the results are what they are. Again, be not judgmental. If that's what they are, that's what they are. But there was a sleight of hand here. I'm sure it was unintentional. But frankly, I think it's catastrophic in the sense of being profoundly misleading. Because the study was all about mindfulness meditation. I mean, that's it. They were just studying mindfulness meditation according to that definition that I quoted just a couple of minutes ago. But now they're equating that with meditation programs. We're going to include all of Buddhist meditation in mindfulness. That's going to be representative of all of Buddhist meditation, and Hindu, and Taoist, and Christian, and Sufi. They've made a generalization here that is profoundly unscientific, radically anti-scientific. You don't take one specimen and then just enlarge this and say, well, meditation, and make a generalization there. That just shows, I think, frankly, ignorance. They really don't know what they're talking about. And I read the media regularly, the BBC, New York Times, the mainstream media. And what I found here, to my chagrin as a Buddhist scholar and practitioner, is very, very often mindfulness meditation is simply equated with meditation, as if the two are just synonymous. And there are enthusiasts of mindfulness meditation that are very, very happy with that equation, saying this is the essence of Buddha, this is Buddhist meditation without the Buddhism. Sometimes they say, rather, I think disparagingly, Buddhist meditation without the mumbo-jumbo, without the claptrap. This is the essence of Buddhist meditation. And then they will really go supernova and say, actually, this is the essence of all of meditation. In fact, this is universal dharma. In fact, they're trying to start a new religion on very, very thin ice. So I think this is really irresponsible, frankly. Scientifically irresponsible. Whatever the conclusion is, fine. But for heaven's sake, don't equate mindfulness meditation with meditation at large. That's simply absurd. But if people are ignorant, they don't know that. And so, but they conclude on this note, stronger study designs are needed to determine the effects of meditation programs in improving the positive dimensions of mental health and stress-related behavior. So, of course, they're not saying this is the definitive and final study, but that is not what we read in the popular media. There's an enormous amount of hype, and I actually could say propaganda, that sometimes quite irresponsibly exaggerates the benefits, and they don't need to. That's my real point here. I know many people who are teachers of mindfulness meditation, people who are practicing mindfulness meditation, and they're getting a lot of benefit. And so they don't need to exaggerate what is clearly a benefit. Just lower the rhetoric. It's helpful. But it's not the essence of all meditation. If they would calm down a little bit, I think it would be helpful. But we come back to this theme of what exactly does it mean to be non-judgmental, to maintaining, frankly, as much as possible. Because that's the idea. You want to be mindful throughout the whole course of the day, not just for 20 minutes in the morning or half an hour in the morning. Mindfulness should be, cultivated as much as possible throughout the course of the day. And this means maintain this non-judgmental stance. Well, in fairness, and I really want to be fair, I've known Jon Kabat-Zinn now for, again, since 1992, when I heard him give a 2.5-hour presentation on mindfulness to the Dalai Lama, and I was translating for the Dalai Lama at the time. And I asked John, who's a very good man, I asked him, John, what do you mean when you say, because he's introduced this term, what do you mean when you say that mindfulness is non-judgmental? What do you mean by that? I went to the horse's mouth, right, to the source. And he said, and what I meant is when we're witnessing things, anything at all, that we simply be aware of what's arising there prior to all the superpositions I like, I don't like, I hope, I fear, and so forth. Just deal with what's there, be aware of what's there, without conflating it with your desires, hopes, and fears, anxieties, and so forth. Fair enough. But here is the most commonly used scientific measure. It's a questionnaire of whether people are successfully cultivating mindfulness. And here's a whole section I took from this very, very widely used scientific measure. And I must say I was deeply troubled. You are not practicing mindfulness if you experience any of the following. I criticize myself for having irrational or inappropriate emotions. So if you have irrational, inappropriate emotions, then just be here now and accept them, I guess. But don't be critical. Don't use any discernment. In other words, remember what Nagasena said. This is the opposite, right? I tend to evaluate whether my perceptions are right or wrong. You should stop doing that. Whether your perceptions are right or wrong, don't be judgmental. That means, like, to my mind, it's a recipe to become an idiot. Really. You're not even checking to see whether your perceptions are valid or invalid, because that would be judgmental, and, oh, we mustn't do that. It gets worse. I tell myself that I shouldn't be feeling the way that I'm feeling, as if whatever you're feeling is just hunky-dory. It's just fine. You want to go out and murder somebody? Just what can you do? Accept it. Be here now. I believe some of my thoughts are abnormal or bad, and I shouldn't think that way. In other words, it doesn't matter what you think, just be there. But what about cultivating the mind? Doesn't have any role. It looks like abject irresponsibility here. I make judgments about whether my thoughts are good or bad. But isn't that called discerning intelligence? Isn't that called actually samma sati? And I say, don't do that. This is not only not the essence of Buddhist meditation, it looks like antithetical to all of Buddhist meditation. I tend to make judgments about how worthwhile or worthless my experiences are. Isn't that something good to evaluate? How meaningful, worthwhile? Isn't that good? Isn't it showing discernment? I tell myself I shouldn't be thinking the way I'm thinking, but aren't some ways of thinking totally inappropriate, useless, and counterproductive? Aren't there some types of thinking that better to stop? Isn't that just kind of common sense? And it's suggesting throw common sense to the wind. I think some of my emotions are bad or inappropriate. I shouldn't feel them, but aren't some emotions very bad? Like emotions of malice, hatred, lust, jealousy. Aren't those bad in the sense of being very harmful? I disapprove of myself when I have irrational ideas. You know, what really strikes me about this is the word I, me, I. And that's not the Buddhist approach at all. It's not me, it's not I, it's mental events. Some are wholesome and some are unwholesome. It's not criticizing myself. The Buddhist view is be discerningly mindful of whether the mental factors coming up are helpful or not helpful, beneficial or not helpful. It's not about me, criticizing me. Who is that me anyway? And so I think the whole thing is skewed. The whole questionnaire is profoundly irrational. Usually when I have distress, I dispose myself when I have irrational ideas. I think this is an irrational idea. Usually when I have distressing thoughts or images, I get angry that this happens to me. Okay, well, that's not so helpful. Usually when I have distressing thoughts or images, I judge myself, me, as good or bad, depending upon what thought or image it's about. So I just have to say, I think this is a terribly ill-conceived, and not only useless, but terribly unhelpful way of evaluating one's meditative practice. For those of us familiar with the Buddha Dhamma, the theme in Sanskrit called pratitya samutpada is enormously important. One could say there's no more important theme in Buddhist meditation, philosophy, and so forth, dependent origination. How phenomena arise in mutual interdependence with each other. And we don't get that by snapshots. You don't get a snapshot and then figured out everything from a snapshot or a whole series of snapshots. We need to see interrelationships. This occurred and then that occurred. This didn't occur, then that did occur or did not, and so forth. And so this entails a type of mindfulness that carries over through time, that's aware of the past, is aware of what's coming in the future, and then sees the interconnectivity of events playing out over time, right? The Four Noble Truths is a matter of pratitya samutpada, events playing out over time. And so in a study presented at the Society for Neuroscience very, very eminent society. Its annual meeting in November 2013, it was found that the higher adults scored on a measure of mindfulness, the worse they performed on tests of implicit learning. And what is that? The kind that underlies all sorts of acquired skills and habits, but that occurs without conscious awareness. In the study, participants were shown a long sequence of items and repeatedly challenged to guess which one would come next, which means they need to see the interrelationship, right? But they're practicing here and now, here and now, here and now, here and now, and then they're not getting the big picture. They're getting a whole bunch of staccato flashes, but their mindfulness is preventing them from seeing the interconnectivity that spreads out over time. You may miss seeing relationships if you're always focusing on staccato moments of the present moment. So although supposedly random, it contained a hidden pattern, that's the whole point, that made some items more likely to appear than others. The more mindful participants were, the more mindful participants were worse at intuiting the correct answers. In other words, it impairs implicit learning. It impairs recognition of patterns, which you don't get by just being here and now in a non-judgmental way. You need to be discerning and see how things interconnect over time. So that's a bit of a limitation. And then we have this big one. Yoga's been around for quite a long time by now. And it's become a very, very lucrative industry. And it's been decontextualized very, very widely. Not always, but very widely. And so it's all about health, it's about fitness, it's about good appearance, about weight loss, about plasticity, sex appeal, and so forth. Very often with no context of ethics. Patanjali's been blown to the winds. The whole rich and profound, wise framework of yoga within the Yoga Sutras abandoned. And then it's a very lucrative way to make a living if you're good at it, and you're good at marketing. As that happened in yoga, it's now mindfulness is big business. And so here's a statement from The Economist. The biggest problem with mindfulness is that it is becoming part of the self-help movement, and hence part of the disease that it is supposed to cure. Gurus talk about the competitive advantage of meditation. Pupils come to see it as a way to get ahead in life. And the point of the whole exercise is lost. I think it's kind of obvious. We've seen the point of the whole exercise. We looked at the two types of happiness, hedonic, eudaimonic. We've seen the context, the Eightfold Noble Path, the three higher trainings, ethics, samadhi, and wisdom. And all of that's lost. And you wind up with a technique that's told, this will solve your problem. This will release your stress. This will make you more productive. This will make you healthier, happier. But frankly, I know scientists. I know some of the best scientists in the world doing the research on mindfulness meditation virtually all the time. The measurements are looking at the hedonic benefits of mindfulness. Health benefits, good. I want to be healthy. Everybody does. But it's hedonic. I like to be productive. Nothing wrong with that. As long as something producing something good, that's hedonic. I don't really want to make more money, but many people do. That's hedonic. It's missing the whole point. And that is, it's not only taking mindfulness out of the context of ethics, mental balance, and wisdom. Whenever you decontextualize, you can be certain that in the very act of decontextualizing, you are recontextualizing it. You can't leave it in mid-air. You can't leave it in deep space with no context. Deep space is a context too. So if you've taken mindfulness out, and this is standard, this is called the secular approach to Buddhism, which is being celebrated and widely advertised as great triumph. Secular Buddhism, stripped of context, stripped of insight, the deepest insights of the Buddha on the night of his enlightenment. And somehow that secularizes it. I think it denudes it, eviscerates it. To my mind, it's my opinion, the first great secular teacher of Buddhism was the Buddha. He didn't ask people to first believe in reincarnation, karma, nirvana, 6 realms of existence, and so forth. He didn't ask people to first believe all that. He simply taught them to help them. He taught secular Buddhism. When he's teaching ethics, he teaches ethics. When he's teaching Satipatthana, the 4 applications of mindfulness, he didn't say, do you believe this first? Do you believe that? He just simply taught them. And so I have nothing really against secular Buddhism, but really, what are they secularizing? And when they're taking practices like mindfulness out of the Buddhist context, which people are free to do, I'm glad people have that freedom, where are they putting it? You're taking it out of one cabinet, but what cabinet are you putting it into? Because you're not putting it into no cabinet. Secular doesn't mean no context. In this context, it just means not Buddhist. You took it out of Buddhism, where did you put it? And this author here from The Economist is saying, pupils come to see it as a way to get ahead in life, pursuit of hedonic pleasure, and the point of the whole point of exercise is lost. What has parading, and I don't even know how to pronounce this, what has parading around in pricey Hululemon? I don't know. I think it's fashion. What's that got to do with, it was strutting about in these outfits, got to do with the Buddhist ethic of non-attachment to material goods when you're practicing mindfulness to get ahead in the marketplace? Aren't we missing something here? And what has staring at a computer-generated dot, which is one of the standard psychological measures, you sit in front of a computer screen and doing these different measurements. What's that got to do with the ancient art of meditation? I mean, it's completely trivial, meaningless exercise. How does that relate to the enormously meaningful array of practices of the close application of mindfulness as taught by the Buddha? Western capitalism seems to be doing rather more to change Eastern religion than Eastern religion is doing to change Western capitalism. Well, it's pretty tough. But I think we have to take it seriously. It's not the only truth, but I think he's not making this up. It's not fiction. There's a framework that I've seen very frequently in the Interdependent tradition that I found enormously meaningful. It's very simple, too. As we speak in terms of the framework of Buddhist practice, the path, ethics, samadhi, wisdom, there's another triad. And in Tibetan, it's ta gom chö, really easy, so short, bum, bum, bum. Ta gom chö. Ta is view. It's how we view reality. Well, how we make sense of the world around us. What kind of a world do you think you're living in? Who do you think you are? What's the nature of other people? What's the nature of the mind? What's the nature of consciousness? Is ethics something we just make up, or does it have a deeper rootedness in reality? Worldview. What kind of a world do you think you're inhabiting, and what kind of a person do you think you are? What does it mean to be a human being? That's view. Worldview. There's one element. And then, from the Tibetan, gom is meditation. You have the view, your actual practice itself, when you're formally engaging in practice. And then there's chö, which is your way of life, conduct. What do you do with your life? How do you spend your time when you're not just sitting on the meditation cushion? Those three. And so when we look in the context of Buddhism, there's a Buddhist worldview that really informs, it illuminates, it provides a very meaningful framework for your formal meditative practice, whatever that may be. It could be vipassana, it could be shamatha, it could be cultivation of the 4 Brahma Viharas, loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. So tremendously wide and rich array of practices within Buddhism, within Theravada Buddhism alone, let alone Mahayana or Chan or Tibetan Buddhism. And of course, the other traditions, Hindu, Christian, and so forth. So there's a profound interrelationship between the way you're viewing reality, what you think is true, and your formal practice. And then your formal practice, your meditation, is embedded, of course, in your way of life. How do you spend your time? What do you do with your time? So these three are profoundly interrelated and mutually supportive, nurturing. Your meditation deepens, clarifies your view of reality. Your meditation brings greater meaning, greater joy to your whole way of life. But your way of life, when cultivated, supports your meditation. The meditation deepens your view. So there's this wonderful intermingling, like 3 fountains flowing into the same pool, all supporting, reinforcing each other. So we can take a simple practice like mindfulness of breathing or mindfulness meditation. We can take that, and we can, people do it all the time. You can take that out of this very rich triad of you, the wide range of Buddhist meditations, the whole field of one conduct saturated by ethics, you can pluck it out of that. But when you pluck it out of this very rich environment that's so enormously supportive for your meditative practice, where are you putting it? And I would suggest there's something that we find east and west. We find in communist countries, we find in capitalist countries, we find in religious countries and not religious countries. It's another triad. It's not everywhere. It's not equally distributed, but it crops up everywhere. And the worldview here is one of materialism, physicalism, naturalism. Very simple. It's the view, which I know many, many people who embrace this, the view that the whole of reality consists of physical phenomena, configurations of matter and energy, space, time, and their emergent properties. That's it. That's really all there is to the whole universe, is matter and its emergent properties. Or, more sophisticatedly, matter, energy, space, time, and their emergent properties and qualities. And there's really nothing there's nothing non-physical. That's it. And there are many very intelligent, knowledgeable people who think that's it. That's the way things are. I've read them, I've spoken with them, I've debated with them. It's very common. So there's a worldview, completely incompatible with Buddhism, but it's one that many people embrace. But a worldview never stands by itself. Buddha's worldview doesn't stand by itself. It's integrated with the rest. And so materialists, people embracing a materialistic worldview, many of them don't meditate, most don't meditate, but then take out meditation, because that's kind of specific for spiritual practice, and where meditation was, put in values. Values. Your priorities, your values. If you're a materialist, what will you value? Well, you'll value only what you think is real. Nobody values what you think isn't real. Easter bunnies, fairies, tooth fairies, and so forth. We don't believe in them. We don't value them. We don't supplicate them. We don't take them into account. They don't exist, right? And so nobody values what they think has no existence whatsoever. And we do value various things that we think do exist. The materialist, the person who embraces a materialistic worldview, is going to value only that which she thinks is real. Physical phenomena and their emergent properties. And they assume mind, consciousness, our whole subjective field of experience is all an emergent property of the brain. So there's a materialistic worldview. And in terms of values, what will you value? Well, you will value the happiness that you can get from the material world. In other words, you will value hedonia. Because that's what you get from the material world. It's stimulus-driven. It comes from acquisition and consumption. And so your values, not in a crude or vulgar sense, but in the way I defined it earlier, hedonia, will be hedonic. A materialistic world will naturally give rise to and support hedonic values. That's not evil, it's not crude, it may be, but not by definition. It's just you're looking for kind of pleasure you can get from manipulating matter. And then there's a way of life. The way of life is always implicated, whether it's spiritual, anti-spiritual, whatever. And so if you're holding a materialistic worldview, hedonic set of values, what will be your way of life? And I will say it will be one dominated by acquisition and consumption. Consumer-driven. You'll follow a consumer-driven way of life. What else would you do? There's nothing else to do. So there's a triad. I'm not asking anybody here to agree with me. I'm presenting this as a topic I've given some thought to, and I'm very concerned. Because we do have 7 billion people on the planet. And this worldview, that triad that I just synopsize, is not uncommon. How is it going to turn out if a very significant proportion of 7 billion people want something better in life, and they think better is hedonic and all about consumption and acquisition? How's that going to turn out? They're all going to be consuming more and more and more with diminishing natural resources. How does that turn out in any way that is not catastrophic? So I think the stakes here are very high. Mindfulness can entirely transform your whole way of life, giving rise to an enormous degree, a deep and transformative degree of genuine, authentic well-being. or it can simply be appropriated within a materialistic worldview, hedonic set of values, and a way of life that's all about consumption and acquisition. And it can help you consume more and acquire more. That's what this author from The Economist is talking about. It's not only missing the point, it's going in the opposite direction. So I think these are issues of major concern. Bear attention. We have to wrap up now. We're going to have about a half an hour at the end. But a very dear friend of mine and a very fine scholar, a very good monk, Bhikkhu Bodhi, a disciple of Nyanaponika Thera, whose writings have enormously inspired me over the last 45 years. I've maintained a correspondence. I've never met him, but I've maintained a very meaningful correspondence with Bhikkhu Bodhi for years now. And I asked him, bear attention, bear attention. Many people are equating mindfulness with bear attention, then equating vipassana with mindfulness, and all of vipassana is now reduced to bear attention. And who coined the term, bear attention, in English? It was Nyanaponika Thera. He coined the term. And so I asked Bhikkhu Bodhi, what were his thoughts? What was his thoughts on bear attention? And this is what Bhikkhu Bodhi told me. Nyanaponika himself did not regard bear attention as capturing the complete significance of satipatthana, but as representing only one phase, the initial phase in the meditative development of right mindfulness, or what I've called authentic mindfulness. He held that in the proper practice of right mindfulness, sati has to be integrated with sampajanya, which Bhikkhu Bodhi commonly translates as clear comprehension, and it is only when these two work together that right mindfulness can fulfill its intended purpose. In other words, the reduction of mindfulness to bear attention is utterly incorrect and very, very widespread. Incorrect and profoundly misleading. And from the man who coined the term, I think we have to take him as being pretty definitive. I'm going to slip over briefly now to Tibetan Buddhism, two of the greatest contemplative meditation masters from the 19th century, Ledab Lingpa, who is a close confidant, friend, and mentor of the 13th Dalai Lama. And he writes in one text that I've translated of a specific type of mindfulness where you're directing, it's a type of shamatha practice, where you're developing your attention skills by observing mental events, thoughts, images, and so forth arising. Here's the quintessence of it. Whatever kinds of mental imagery occur, be they gentle or violent, subtle or gross, of long or short duration, strong or weak, good or bad, in this shamatha practice, observe their nature and avoid any obsessive evaluation of them as being one thing and not another. Does that sound similar to the earlier definition of mindfulness in the psychological context? This is traditional Buddhism. This is a classic shamatha technique related especially to the Mahamudra and Dzogchen traditions of Tibetan Buddhism. It's a marvelous practice. I've done it for thousands of hours. I found it enormously rich. But it's a shamatha practice. It's not even vipassana. It's a shamatha practice. So I could elaborate a lot, and I shall, and the retreat will start tomorrow evening. But now a contemporary of Ledab Lingpa, Dujum Lingpa, one of my heroes, frankly, he comments on this same technique. He teaches it elaborately. I have a whole book on it. It's called Stilling the Mind, commentary on Dujum Lingpa's teachings on this method. And he writes, and I quote, I think people who spend their whole life at this non-judgmental moment-to-moment awareness of whatever's arising in your mind, and regard it as the best of practices, may be fooling themselves by compounding one delusion with another. If I examine those whose lives pass in this way, I see that in the past they have created the causes for spinning around and around in samsara under the influence of dualistic grasping, the reification of self, of other, and the absolute bifurcation between subject and object, dualistic grasping. In other words, they've not even addressed the issue of dualistic grasping. They've not even started to practice vipassana. I see them as just creating causes for spinning around and around samsara under the influence of that old tendency of dualistic grasping. It seems to me as if they persist in overdoing such meditation, what need is there to say that this will act as a great anchor, further grounding them in samsara? So that's not the essence of Buddhist meditation. It's the essence of remaining in samsara mindfully. So time to wrap up. We need some constructive conclusions here. I didn't set this up to show Buddhism is good and mindfulness movement is bad. That's a silly characterization, much more nuanced than that. But I would suggest here my conclusion that the psychological view of mindfulness we saw defined corresponds to a very basic initial phase of Buddhist meditation. It's good to be here now. It's good to bring your attention into the present moment and simply be aware of what's happening. But don't stop there. And don't think That's the essence of all of Buddhist meditation, which is simply absurd. So-called mindfulness meditation has significant benefits, scientifically demonstrated in a myriad of ways, but it is important not to equate it with the essence of Buddhist meditation at large, which is very, very common. And frankly, I just have to be blunt, I think it's terribly false propaganda. Be blunt. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. That is my conclusion. And you see why. To derive the full benefit of mindfulness in the Buddhist sense, or within the Buddhist context, it must be contextualized within the trainings in ethics, mental balance, and wisdom, and be directed towards the ultimate aim of Buddhist practice, whether conceived as liberation from samsara, or cyclic existence, or as the full enlightenment of Buddhahood. So whether Theravada approach, Mahayana approach, the motivation is enormously important. The context is important. Ethics is important. View is important. All of these things are important. Context is enormously important, and to decontextualize from one framework is necessarily to recontextualize in another framework, which may make the whole endeavor entirely different. And I think that's exactly what's happened. So I hope this was useful, meaningful. So we're finished here, and I'd like to turn it now over to both questions and observations, insights, criticisms, or debate. Everything is welcome. Okay? So truly the floor is open. So any of the above, questions, comments, insights, anything at all. So, good, we'll start here. Yes, right over here on the left, thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, now I can.
I would like to hear your view of how you view Dharma teachers charging money for Dharma teachings, especially since we've come such a long way from the Buddha's time when it was not necessary back then. Yeah, so.
It's not in the spirit of the Buddhist teachings. You want a short answer? That's it. It's not in the spirit of the Buddhist teachings. He never charged. None of his disciples ever charged. I've lived in Sri Lanka for 6 months as a monk. I've lived in Thailand for 2 years. I've lived in Buddhist countries. I've lived with Tibetans in India for 6 years. I've been to Tibet 4 times. And in Buddhist countries, that's not the way it's done. Dharma is too valuable to charge. Gold isn't. A house isn't, a car isn't, but Dharma is too valuable. And yet here we are. From Santa Barbara, where I live, to Hong Kong, very long swim. And I wouldn't have done it. And I couldn't have done it. And so somebody had to pay for airfare. So I'm just giving this as an example. I'm a Dharma teacher. Dharma teachers generally don't walk to where they teach unless it's in their home village. So there's things like airfare, that needs to be paid. It's not charging for Dharma. It's saying if you'd like your Dharma teacher to be here, don't expect him or her to pay for it. Not many Dharma teachers are very wealthy, although some are. And so there's airfare, there's accommodation. In Buddhist countries, you never worry about accommodation. There's a monastery, you stay in a layperson's house. There's no ever any question of being charged. And then there's food. So I'm moving on quickly here. There are basic costs in inviting a Dharma teacher to come in Dharma, to teach in Dharma. And those need to be covered. Because you can't expect the Dharma teacher to come and then bankroll everything. That's not reasonable. But beyond that, and then many people all over the world, you have to rent. Here I think, it's a university, this is a university event. You didn't need to rent this hall. But if you come, in many cases, they have to rent the hall. And then there's publicity, and there's organization. There may be paid staff to handle the administration and so forth. That should be covered. It's not paying for Dharma, it's paying for the event to take place at all, right? But on that basis, once you've covered the basic costs, and the people receiving benefit, they should pay for it. It's quite, unless you have a benefactor, that's nice, but not very common. But beyond that, it's dana. I am a Dharma teacher, and I think I'm one of many. I never say, people often ask me, as a modern world, say, how much do you charge? And I say, I don't charge, I'm a Dharma teacher. I receive what's given. If it's nothing, it's nothing. I won't miss any meals. And whatever it is above nothing, that's your choice. And so I think that's the appropriate way. And then there are wonderful teachers like Goenka, who has set up, he has people leading his retreats with his recordings all over the world, and there's no charge at all. Not even for the food or accommodations. That's really wonderful. That's really wonderful. And then people donate whatever they can, and if they can't donate anything, then they don't donate anything. But I think we have Dharma teaching, mindfulness meditation has slipped into a mode where often a lot of money is being made, and it's asked for, and I'll end where I started. If a Dharma teacher is coming and say, this is my rate, I think that, but then go into some other business, sell insurance. There's nothing wrong with selling insurance. There is something wrong with selling Dharma. And so that's my very strong conviction, and many teachers abide by that, and then others, especially when Dharma is secularized, frankly, taken out of that context, then some people are making big bucks. And they charge big bucks. Yeah.
Do you think if it's secularized, like Mbsr programs, is it still justified in that situation? Because there's a lot of very successful mindfulness programs that has helped a lot of people, but charge very high fees.
Yeah. Mbsr is a secular program. So frankly, I wouldn't call it Buddhist. I wouldn't call it Buddhist. It doesn't have the context, doesn't have motivation. It's not to say that it's unethical, it's not, but it's not necessarily ethical either. It's not part of the training. I know John, I've known him and I admire him, he's a good friend of mine, but it's not Buddha Dharma. Whatever they like to say, it's not Buddha Dharma. And so it's a kind of therapy. And therapists, psychotherapists, they charge, it's a profession for which they're professionally trained, and they get licensed, and then they teach, or they do, they give therapy. And we all expect therapists can charge a fee. Psychiatrists charge a fee like a medical doctor or a dentist charge a fee. And so if we regard Mbsr as a type of therapy, which I think is much closer than saying it's the essence of Buddhist meditation, then if they want to charge for it, that's their business. But it's not Buddha Dharma. The Dalai Lama made a comment in this regard. I was translating for him in 1992 when John Kabat-Zinn gave a 2.5-hour presentation and reveled in the scientific studies and the benefits it shown. And then one of my professors from Stanford was there. I invited him there. We always had a philosopher for these meetings. And I was on the board of Mind and Life and so forth. And so he came, very, very fine comparative scholar from religious studies at Stanford. He listened to John's whole presentation. And then he turned to the Dalai Lama and said, I have a question. And that is, what do you think of John's work? Is this not a type of plagiarism? Because John is plucking methods from the Buddhist tradition, not giving Buddhism any credit, saying it's not Buddhist, and then he's marketing it and making a lot of money, and that's not a criticism of John, it's a fact. What do you think? What do you think of what he's doing? Is this plagiarism? Is this right, wrong? What do you think? And I remember very vividly the Dalai Lama's response. And he said, well, we've seen from the scientific studies, and this is way back in 1992, there's been so many more since then, John has clearly demonstrated there are a lot of practical benefits, health benefits, and so forth. So here's the point. I think it's a true point as far as I know. Whatever disease you're suffering from a mild cold to terminal cancer, the whole spectrum, if you're stressed, that will aggravate the symptoms. Insofar as you have less stress, the symptoms will be somewhat less. Maybe very, very helpful. Rule of thumb. So this is about stress reduction. I mean, it was taught, John taught it in a clinical setting. University of Massachusetts Medical School. And so the Dalai Lama's response was, well, what this work is, this mindfulness meditation, this Mbsr, it's helping to alleviate suffering. The Buddha Dharma is all about alleviating suffering. This is a good thing. That's his first statement, but he's not quite finished. He said, but don't mistake this for Buddha Dharma. That didn't make it into the book. The book is called Healing Emotions. That was the transcript. That got plucked out. So I want to pluck it back in, because it is important. And they really need to stop the rhetoric that this is the essence of Buddhism, because it's just not true. And they don't need to say things not true about something that's really beneficial. If it was something toxic, then they'd have to lie. But it's not toxic. So just don't exaggerate. And then I relax, and they're doing something that's not Buddhism, but is helpful. And those of us who are Buddhist teachers, we try to teach Buddhism. Okay?
Thank you. Very nuanced view.
You're welcome. Yeah. Observations, yes, there was a very vigorous hand going up.
Thanks very much for everything you've said. I just want to check one thing. Towards the end of your talk, you were talking about the materialist view of the world.
Yes,
And you
Daniel
jumped-
Dennett. I was pretty much quoting Daniel Dennett. He's an arch materialist.
Right, you went forward to talk about the way of life that's associated with that.
Indeed,
You said
yes.
it was about acquisition.
Yes.
But surely it includes love of children, love of art, or, everything, all the positive things. That's one thing I'd like to... It's not just about acquisition. I mean, if a mother is caring for a baby, I can't see where the acquisition is in there. The other thing, could you just clarify? You said this materialist view is not compatible with Buddhism. Could you just explain why that is the case?
Sure, I'm happy to. Your first point is unequivocally well taken. I know a lot of materialists. Some of my very good friends are materialists. They're very ethical, not all of them, of course, but among my friends, a lot of scientists who are very explicitly embracing a materialistic worldview. Many of them are very ethical, they're altruistic, very loving parents. If they're professors, I know some of them really take exceptionally good care of their graduate students. They're fine people, people I'm happy to call my friends, and they are materialistic, and they are really focusing on hedonia. Are they all a bunch of, pardon me, greedy bastards? No, clearly not. And Daniel Dennett is one of the most articulate advocates of materialism. And he points out love of art, love of music, love of philosophy, love of nature, and so forth. This is completely compatible with a materialistic worldview. That's true. It's true. Does materialism support that? This could be another whole lecture. If I view you, if I take this seriously, I think frankly, now it's my opinion, I think most materialists don't follow the implications of what they say they believe. If I really believe that you are simply a body, there's nothing more to you. This is, some philosophers I know, there's nothing more to you than your body. You are your body. In fact, you are your brain. Antonio Damasio, he spoke at one of the earlier Mind and Life meetings, and he made this statement, almost a direct quote, "You are a brain carrying a body on your back." Okay? Now, imagine that I think of you as a brain. A brain is a lump of flesh. I mean, really, let's not mystify this. It's chemicals and electricity inside your brain. That's all there is in there. Chemicals and electricity inside your brain. Very complex, but let's not pretend there's anything else inside there. I've now equated you with a lump of chemicals and electricity, electrified chemicals in your brain. And moreover, direct implication of materialism is you're actually not making any decisions at all. Many people say that explicitly. Starting with Thomas Huxley, 150 years ago. You don't have free will, but you don't actually have any will at all. You're not making any decisions. It's the brain doing everything. Look at the modern media. It's everywhere nowadays. The brain's doing this, brain's doing that. Hardly ever do they ever anymore say the mind is doing this, let alone you're doing it. The brain feels this, the brain figures out this, the brain learns this, the brain remembers this. That was never actually demonstrated. But that is a direct implication of materialism. So now I'm going to be viewing you as a brain. And you have no free will, which means actually you're not responsible for anything you do. If you're making no decisions, you're not responsible. A robot is not responsible for its behavior because it's a robot. What does it mean to love you now? The Dalai Lama, in that same meeting, when all the scientists and the philosopher in the room were all card-carrying, hardcore materialists, they're really quite emphatic about it. In fact, one of them said, quietly, the Dalai Lama is smart enough, I think we can bring him over to our side. They didn't. The Dalai Lama heard this for 2 days. It was the second Mind and Life meeting back in 1989, the year he won the Nobel Prize. He learned about the Nobel Prize when we were with him in California. And he listened to all of this. You are a brain, you're a brain, you're a brain, there's nothing to you, you're just your matter, all of your mental states, phenomena, everything, just emergent properties of the brain, functions of the brain. They are the brain, variations of the same thing. The Dalai Lama turned to them then, after he heard their spiel. And they all sang the same song. They were like a choir. They all sang the same song. One was a psychiatrist, another neuroscientist, another philosopher, another psychologist, and so forth. And then he said, do you love brains? This is a Buddhist monk saying, do you love brains? And I say, by love, I mean as you love your children, as you love your spouse, your family, love other people. When you think of a brain, do you love brains? First, it was remarkable. I was interpreting for it again. I was right in the midst of it. And they all said yes. Every single one of them said, yes, we love brains. They knew what they said, so this immediately follows. They're not a bunch of loveless, awful people. They're normal people like you and me. They all said yes. Yes, we love brains. And then the Dalai Lama he came back and said, really? You look at a brain, and you have the same feeling, the same heart, the affection, the warmth, as you do when you look at your child. You look at a brain, you feel the same thing? Really? And then one by one, he did this. Well, not really. I find the brain interesting, fascinating, but when I look at a brain, do I feel the love I feel when I look at my child? All of them, except for the philosopher, backed off. Because they knew they're honest people. And nobody loves brains. Let's give us a break here. Do you love a liver? Do you love a kidney, a kneecap? It just doesn't make any sense, We love people, we love animals, we love sentient beings. But to love a brain makes as much sense as loving a nose, The only person who stuck by her guns was the philosopher, because philosophers have, as their ultimate criterion, maintain consistency of your view. Even if you know what you're saying is not true. Maintain consistency, otherwise you collapse as a philosopher. So I think there are materialists, I know there are materialists who are very loving people, very compassionate people. I would say it's despite their worldview. The worldview doesn't support it. I'm very troubled by this. I'm very troubled by racism everywhere. American racism, any kind of racism, doesn't matter. Racism is racism. It's looking at people of different ethnic groups, skin color, and so forth, and seeing, I see you, and I know by nature you're inferior to me. In fact, you're really just an animal. The American slave trade, all of that. How do they justify this bestial behavior? Inexpressibly evil behavior of going into Africa like a bunch of the worst thugs on the planet, kidnapping people, putting them on a boat, letting them die along the way, and then enslaving them, breaking up. How can we even imagine civilized human beings doing that, let alone calling themselves Christian? How is that conceivable? Well, it is conceivable. Don't regard them as human. Regard them as animals. Now, of course, that all puts you in a position for animals that they're nothing. They're just to be used, exploited, tortured. It doesn't make any difference. They're just animals. But now imagine you've now reduced a whole group of people to mere animals. That means you can, like when the Nazis referred to Jews as vermin. What do you do with vermin if you're, a European who doesn't follow ahimsa all that much? You kill them. You're cleaning house, you clear them. If you have lice, you clear them. You have rats, you kill them. You kill vermin, and that's a good thing. And so they regard it as a whole ethnic group as vermin, and then with no conscience, no reservations, did their best to exterminate them from all of Europe. How could they do that? The Germans are not bestial people. I've lived in Germany. They're not awful people. They're like Americans, Chinese, Indians. They're people. But how could they do this? It defies the imagination until it doesn't. They could, because they didn't regard them as human beings. Right? Now let's take it a step further. Animals, after all, have feelings. If you kick a dog, it yelps. If you pet a dog, it may wag its tail and lick you. Who in his right mind can deny that they have feelings? Right? But what if you take an animal and then reduce it to a robot? A mindless robot that's just programmed. I have no qualms about kicking a robot. Why should I? They don't feel anything. If I own the robot, I can do whatever I like with it. I can put it in the garbage disposal, I can kick it, I can burn it, as I can with my cell phone. It's my cell phone. I can do whatever I like with it. It's just a robot. It's just a machine. An implication of materialism is you're just a machine. Daniel Dennett says human beings are mindless robots made up of mindless robots. In the Atlantic Monthly, this very kind of highbrow journal in America, there's an article in print right now. Somebody just sent it to me by email from Michael Graziano, who's a very distinguished neuroscientist at Princeton University. He solved the mind-body problem. as a material by saying there's no mind. Consciousness doesn't exist. Let the dominoes fall and see where materialism takes you. It will reduce human beings to animals and animals to robots, and now you can do whatever you like to anybody. Now, that doesn't mean that materialists are all sinister, evil people at all. It's not true. But the materialism invites that. And if they are loving, compassionate, altruistic, ethical people, which many of them are, it's despite their materialism, not because of it. A lot of passion here, because the stakes are high. Yes, please, in the back.
Thank you very much for your sharing. I wanted to share a perception of mine and also a quick comment. But first of all, thank you very much for sharing your opinions.
I try to say this is my opinion, and other times this is just fact. I try to make that distinction. Carry on.
Yes, thank you. And to kind of delineate what's happening with the kind of mindfulness movement that you talked about. And personally, I do agree that mindfulness is a way of living instead of just a technique or a skill. I think one of the slides you were quite emotional was at the facet mindfulness scale.
Yes, I was.
I don't know if you've gone through Mbsr. I have. And I think my perception of that, and I'm very well aware that a lot of times people say perception is deception. So I'm just offering my perception, and it could be just the tail of the elephant or the trunk of the elephant. So it's just part of the picture. But perhaps both of our perceptions can make a bigger picture. So if you look at the facets statements, a lot of them, yes, there is a delineation of good or bad emotions.
And everything else.
Sorry?
And everything else.
Right.
Valid, invalid, etc. You saw the whole list. It was a big one.
Yes. And I think, to me, when I read it, the emphasis was feeling bad about the unwholesome things that have arisen. So it is that added judgment, which John talks about, the non-judgment. And and I think that refers to an analogy that Buddha talked, which was the second arrow. When we already are in pain, we cause more suffering because of the judgment, because of, I should not be feeling that. And so that's my take on that when I read those. So the emphasis to me on those statements were when those unpleasant feelings arise, then do I give myself a hard time and give myself a second arrow? So I think that's the teaching in the course that I've experienced. So it's not that we're not taught not to delineate, but once we delineate, then we don't give ourselves a hard time and a second arrow and increase the suffering, which is part of liberating from the suffering.
May I respond? I think you've made some very interesting points. This is why I made a real point before addressing that slide. But I asked John, founder of Mbsr, John, what do you mean by non-judgmental? And I commented on it. That makes a lot of sense. That what's happening, be aware of what's happening before the overlay of I like, I don't like, I hope, I fear, and so forth. I had no criticism. And then I said, but some people don't stay there, and they go into that expanded version, where basically you're abandoning any type of discernment at all. And if you do so, you're being successful. That's not Jon Kabat-Zinn, and I was not criticizing Mbsr or Jon Kabat-Zinn. I was criticizing that mindfulness measure, which Jon Kabat-Zinn did not. He was not one of the authors of it.
Yeah,
and so I wanted to. I'm fond of John. He's a good man. I think he overstates the case on occasion. I think it's not helpful, but he didn't advocate that. That was somebody else, and that's what I was saying. They've gone overboard here. They've gone way overboard. You know, we have a noun and an adjective in English, and they're totally different. If I say that you're exercising in your comments, you exercise very good judgment. That's a nice thing to say, isn't it? You showed very good judgment. That's good. You know that's a compliment. Whereas if I say, you're being very judgmental, oh, you know, that's bad. I mean, nobody thinks that's a good thing to say. So the noun is good, but the adjective is bad, right? And my point here is that being judgmental, nobody thinks that's a good idea. Not the Buddhists, not the Mbsr. Nobody thinks being judgmental, holier than thou, standing, always judging, criticizing, you know, throwing the first stone, and so forth. Nobody thinks that's good. Nobody in his right mind. But what about sound judgment? This is what Nagasena, he built that into the very definition of right mindfulness. He never said be judgmental, but he said be discerning, exercise good judgment. And a crucial point here is not just I feel good, I feel bad. Mental afflictions, klesha, they're judged not by whether you feel good or bad, but by whether they afflict or do not afflict the mind, whether they create disturbance, imbalance, distortion. Those are mental afflictions. So one could be feeling enormous lust or greed and feel really good about it. You know, feel really happy. Man, I'm going to swindle this person. I'm so much smarter than these people. I'm going to swindle them. I'm going to get all their money. And man, this feels good. I'm so much smarter than they are. And then you succeed. And man, oh boy, now I can buy that Mercedes I always wanted. It's a mental affliction all the way through, and it feels really good. Right? And so the discernment, it's not simply whether you feel good or bad, but with discerning intelligence, recognizing, is this tendency, is this afflictive, following the course of beneficial and unbeneficial tendencies? Not whether simply they feel good or bad, but if these thoughts, these emotions, these desires, let alone the speech, the behavior that flows from them, are they constructive, not constructive, beneficial, not beneficial, wholesome, not wholesome? To throw that out in the name of being non-judgmental, which John never said, in my hearing, and I've known him for a long time now. We've had many conversations. But it is in that questionnaire. Throw it out discernment. And that's why I got a bit emotional about it. Because I think it's a terrible evaluation of any type of meditation. But it's not a criticism of John. He never said that. So the criticism was very focused, and that's why I highlighted John did not say this. And as you well know, you don't need me to reinforce it, Mbsr has enriched the lives of many, many people, and it's not just a technique. It's more than that, and Buddhism is a lot more than that. And some people are satisfied with Mbsr and don't really want to go into Buddhism, and that's fine. And people want to go into Buddhism, well, there's a lot more, but it's misleading to tell people you've already got the essence of all of Buddhism. It's just flat out misleading. That's not true, and it shouldn't be stated. It's not needed. You know, Mbsr stands on its own. It's an outstanding, beneficial, helpful, scientifically proven array of practices which can become a way of life. If you just leave there, I think everyone's in good shape. I have nothing to criticize. Okay? Yes, maybe final one for tonight.
Hello?
Hi.
Professor Wallace, I was wondering if you could speak to, I've been meeting and speaking with Bhikkhu Bodhi myself, and he's pointed out the danger of intellectual quietism that we can start retreating into. Sure. And I think from traveling around the United States and staying at temples there, there's the material context in which a lot of these temples are allowed to be built and arises. They're still coming, the masters are still coming back to Asia and sure. giving them money to sustain them. And so I was wondering if we could speak to a little bit of that, because then I was living at a temple in Missouri, and it was only 1 hour away from Ferguson, but there was no outreach, no one coming of, you know, who are predominantly black and brown, who are, and when I speak to the masters, there's this, I don't know if it's a cultural tension, but they're from Malaysia, and I asked them, I was like, you know, aren't these folks more inclined, and don't they deserve an opportunity to realize the truth? You know, sure. they are suffering very sure. Viscerally. Sure. And then I got this talk about, oh, maybe it's their karma. And And then I just had a challenge, and I was like, then why are we building these houses?
Sure.
Who is going to retreat here? It's a bunch of rich white people and Asians.
Sure.
You know, so I'm curious what you would say to that.
Yeah, no, these are very important issues once again. And I mentioned the kind of the euphoria. It was still hedonic, but it was a very good feeling. From the conversation over dinner this evening, learning about the public outreach of the Center for Buddhist Studies right here. That is not just for elite scholars, people who are seeking a career in academia, or even just for yogis who want to go into meditation and really fathom the very nature of the mind and so on. But on a very, very practical note of Dharma therapy for people who are suffering because of depression, anxiety, either clinically diagnosed, mental types of imbalances. Can we draw from the Buddhist tradition without bringing the whole wagon? That is, if a person is depressed, they didn't put up a little sign, please convert me to Buddhism. If you put up a sign, it would be, I'd like to suffer less. And if you can help, I'd appreciate that, rather than simply relying on drugs that suppress the symptoms. And so I think this is a wonderful exemplar of public outreach. There's no references whatsoever to ethnicity or asking, well, are you a Buddhist? If you're a Buddhist, we'll help you, but if you're not, well, then find somebody else. There's nothing of that. So it's clean. It's secular Dharma in the most meaningful way. I don't think of secular Dharma as being something silly or what have you. I think it's something sometimes trumped up a bit too much. But in this whole field of the interface between psychotherapy, mental health, and Buddhism, I think there can be a lot of mutual benefit. And it needs to be presented in a secular way, as John has very successfully done in a clinical setting with mindfulness. That deserves to be celebrated. He was the one that cracked open the door, more than anybody else I know, to bring this mainstream. That is no mean feat. And for that, I congratulate him. And he's clearly benefited. That one program, tens of thousands of people. As the Dalai Lama said, what's to criticize? We're here to alleviate suffering, not just try to get a bunch of converts, right? And so to my mind, this really, it would be optimal, put it this way. I don't want to be judgmental, but I'd say it would be optimal if Buddhist centers all over the world had that element too. For people interested in Buddhism, maybe they are Buddhists, maybe they are raised as Buddhists. For heaven's sakes, teach them Buddhism, teach them the Four Noble Truths, the 12 links, teach them the whole Buddhist worldview, values, and so forth. But for people in a more secular or mixed society, like Hong Kong, like Singapore, where I've taught, and many other places, there's no homogeneity at all. They're not all anything. They're all over the place. Then the public outreach for children in education, in healthcare, in business, and then see simply people leading their lives who are suffering. If we can draw from the wealth of theory and practice, Bhikkhu Bodhi's point of intellectual quietism is a very important one. I have only admiration for him. He's a marvelous scholar, monk, and really a very esteemed Dharma brother and mentor. I've asked him advice many times. It's a very important point, to reach out. An analogy, not the same, but an analogy, Christian churches, I know in America it's very common. Christian churches, they have a lot of strengths. And one of their strengths is when there's a hurricane, there's a catastrophe, there's a famine, there's a plague, what have you, you find them acting collectively. And sometimes, yes, there are strings attached. They want to try to convert people to Christianity, understandably. But many times there isn't. They collectively gather, they get money, they send volunteers and so forth. Frankly, that's just a wonderful thing. And it's a service to the whole community. Many organizations like Red Cross and so forth, very strong religious, origins to them. That's just to be celebrated, I think. And so I think we have a lot to learn from Christian communities in this regard. That it's not just give us money, we want to build a new church, we want, give us more money. Frankly, Buddhist centers sometimes in the West, you get that impression. Give us money, we want to do this, we want to do this. And it's kind of like a black hole of sucking in money, so they can do something of value. Fair enough. I mean, I like to have Buddhist centers too. But the public outreach is enormously important. And that has to be with no strings attached. And so I only celebrate what's being done here at the Center for Buddhist Studies. And then I travel a lot. This is one of the great boons of traveling and traveling where I do and meeting the people I do. There's another group based in Mexico City. Same theme. Same thing. They're Buddhists. They're all Buddhists. I've been teaching there for 15 years. The resident teacher there is a marvelous teacher. So effective. And it's a group of mostly women and some men working to take themes of theory and practice from Buddhism, secularize them, and bring them to children. For their attention, for mindfulness, for ethics, for genuine happiness, for emotional balance, emotional resilience, things that every parent must value, every sensible parent, and they're helping with no strings attached. I'm working with a group in Bangalore, India. Same thing. They're all Indians doing it, but under the auspices of the Dalai Lama. They're starting a center there. The first thing is, how can we help with education? And can we bring this to business? So the first thing is public outreach. And it has to be secular. The Dalai Lama, we had an audience. I participated by phone. Everybody else was there in person. I was sick. I couldn't travel to Delhi. But he really emphasized this. He said that public outreach, keep it secular. Ethics, yes, secular ethics, but enormously important. But keep it secular. A lot of these people are devout Hindus, or they're Christian, or they're Muslim. Lots of Muslims in India. What you're offering should be equally accessible, inviting to everyone, regardless, and that means it has to be secular. And then he said, separate from that, if you want to teach Buddhist meditation for people really interested in Buddhism, fine, but keep those a bit separate. So people know what they're getting into, and the one is not kind of a technique to pull them in to the other. And then we are looking at creating opportunities for people to go into long-term, very serious, full-time meditative practice. So that's also very good, but keep it separate. The public outreach is what it is. It's really seeking to alleviate suffering and to help people find genuine happiness. What you can market, we'll come back to that theme and then we'll end. You can market hedonic pleasure. You can run workshops, you can run extremely expensive workshops in coaching and so forth to help people progress in their work, get the raises, move up in the hierarchy, make more money, get more prestige, more power, more fame. Those are marketable skills. And they are marketable, and you can make a lot of money in that area. It's not Dharma. It's all about hedonic pleasure. Meditation may be taught in that way. Mbsr may be taught in that way. And depending on the teacher, because there's a wide variety of Mbsr teachers, like there's a wide variety of doctors and a wide variety of Buddhist teachers. Among Mbsr teachers, and I know quite a number of them, some are really coming in very much with a really Dharma motivation, Dharma ethics, and that will come in a secular fashion, and others less so. I won't speak of Mbsr, but mindfulness teachers. There are quite a number of mindfulness teachers who don't even practice meditation, but they're very good. Mouth is very good, you know, and they make money. They make money. And so the teaching and coaching and instructing people in methods to enhance their hedonic well-being, I don't see anything in principle wrong with that, but it's not Dharma. And it's marketable and charged. Go ahead and charge. That's your business. You know. But when it comes to Dharma, it shouldn't be charged, and you offer it to help people cultivate their own authentic well-being from within. Okay? Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wallace, for your very inspiring and wonderful lecture. Professor will offer 2 more public lectures next week. The next one will be held on the 27th, that's next Wednesday, 7 to 9 in the evening with the theme Cultivating Mental Balance, a Buddhist View. The third one will be held on the 29th, that's next Friday, also 7 to 9 in the evening with the theme A Radically Empirical Approach to the Exploration of Consciousness. So please don't miss it, and we hope to see you again in the coming 2 lectures. Thank you and good night.